Okay, I think now's a good enough time to start as any. So thank you very much for all the attendees that are currently here. It's good to see you all. Welcome along to this next in the Tide webinar series. My name's Kuan Hawker. I'm the event manager here at Tide, and I'll introduce our wonderful panelists in a minute on this, hopefully, and well, not hopefully, I know it will be very interesting webinar on GDPR and how you stay on top of the compliance. It's really obviously important thing for small businesses, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about what we do at Tide. I know there are probably quite a lot of people here who maybe aren't members of Tide. And so just for those people, we operate a online business bank account for SMEs to save you time and money, also useful for freelancers. We have around 190,000 customers in the UK at the moment, and we're the fastest growing business current account in the UK, which is a great thing. We're great for startups and small businesses and freelancers. There's no monthly fee or annual fee, no minimum deposits, no credit checks, and so you can try us absolutely risk-free to see if we can help you out with your banking needs. Usually takes about 5 or 10 minutes to set up an account. You receive your account number and sort code immediately, which is fantastic. And the Tide app is packed with sort of time-saving features, such as auto categorization on spending, so you can see exactly where your money's going and when it's gone, which is really, really key for small businesses. Invoices can be paid and generated straight from the app, which means that side of the business becomes really simple and less time consuming for you guys. And you can also set up to 4 sub accounts within each Tide account. So you can have one for your taxes, for your marketing, if you do events, all that kind of stuff. So it really helps you keep on top of things in terms of your banking needs for your small business. I will chat to you again a bit later about how to sign up with Tide, give you a step-by-step process and what you need to look out for from us in terms of emails coming after the event. But I will ask Electra and Katie to introduce themselves and talk about their experience in a moment. I just wanted to run a quick poll as well, just to get an idea of people's understanding of GDPR. So if you all wouldn't mind taking part in this poll, hopefully you can see it. If you could just give us a quick click so we have an understanding of people's knowledge of GDPR. A few more people need to vote. 60%, anybody else? 65%, anybody else going to give us a click? There we go, 69%. It's like watching sports results, this is great. 82% right now, any more for any more? 86. Feels like bigger. 91, can we get 100%? Anybody else? Come on. No, okay, we'll call it a 91%. Thank you for that. So if I share the results, we can see that 67% of people that responded, I know a bit about, but not sure how to apply it in practice, which is perfect for this webinar. Obviously, we'll be giving some maybe higher end tips for the people that say they know what we're doing, and some of the beginning tips for those that are beginners. So that's really helpful for us to know. So thank you very much for that. I will now hand over to Electra and Katie. We're going to have a quick introduction, then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we're going to have a presentation. At the end, there'll be time for Q&A. So if you have any questions going through, please add them into the Q&A section at the bottom. We do have a hard stop at 12, but any questions that we don't manage to answer, we'll take offline and answer them individually. But for now, I shall hand over to Electra and Katie. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. Hi, everyone. I'm Electra. I'm the founder of The Law Boutique, and we specialize in optimizing legal functions within really fast growth organizations. So we work with from small startups to mid-size kind of fast growth tech companies. And we help them with things like setting up their function, but also GDPR, which is a huge topic for everyone. Not only because it's quite complex, but also because it is very time consuming. So I completely empathize with the poll that says, I kind of know what I'm doing, but I'm not sure how to apply it in practice. So hopefully today will help clarify some of those points.
And hi, everyone. I'm Katie. I'm a legal analyst at The Law Boutique. And as Electra mentioned, we work with a lot of companies on GDPR and helping them maintain compliance. So this will be hopefully educational for you, and we'll get some good tips.
Cool. So before we go straight into what does the new normal look like for GDPR, I just wanted to cover some basics about this law, because it doesn't have the best reputation. So I wanted to clear some things up. So I'm sure that everyone in the room has heard of GDPR, but what does being GDPR compliant actually mean? And I think it's helpful to understand a little bit about the background of GDPR and why it came into play. So effectively, the GDPR is a law that aims to give individuals control over their personal data by doing two things. On the one hand, it puts obligations on organizations that control that data. And on the other, it gives legal rights to the data subjects or the individuals who share that data with those companies. And people often think that the GDPR is a law that was brought in to make their lives difficult. Actually, it was introduced by the EU Commission after they realized that data was in fact the new currency. So we see organizations like Facebook, Google, a free service, but obviously you're giving them something to receive that service, and that something is your personal data. It's really, really valuable. So when the EU Commission realized that this was the new currency, and also saw how some organizations weren't really taking care of the data in an ethical way, they decided that in order to protect the economic value that this kind of new transaction was creating, they needed to bring in a law that had teeth. So they brought in the GDPR with really high fines, some quite stringent rules around it. And the aim is to enable the economy to continue in this new way. So effectively, since the GDPR was brought into force in May 2018, more than 1/3 of adults aged 16 to 75 say that they trust companies and organizations with their personal data more since the GDPR came into effect, which is actually good for business if you think about it, because as I said, data is really valuable. 56% of people asked said that they're more likely to do business with companies and organizations that have some kind of certification mark or seal to demonstrate GDPR compliance. Now that's not currently possible yet, but that's in the roadmap for GDPR. So soon we'll be able to get some kind of certification to show that we are GDPR compliant. For now, it's really important to just show customers that you respect personal data and that you have a framework in place to adhere to your obligations and also enable them to exercise their rights if they need to. So the GDPR covers all personal data that belongs to individuals that are based in the EU. It also applies to companies that are in the EU, regardless of where they process data that belongs to individuals outside of the EU. It's quite a confusing sentence. So if you're a company that's based in the EU, then you must adhere to GDPR regardless of where your customers are. So if all your customer base is in America, you still need to comply with GDPR. But if you're in India and you have customers in the EU, you still need to comply with the GDPR. So this is why, another reason why this law is quite different to other laws, because it has this this effect over various jurisdictions. So it's a really strong piece of law. So an individual or a data subject, as the GDPR affectionately likes to refer to human beings, covers any living human. That means that the law does not apply to companies. So a company email address that's info@abc.com is not personal data, but John Smith at abc.com is personal data. However, the law does not apply to businesses, it applies to human beings. And defining the term personal data is a little bit tricky. There's no clear-cut list of what personal data exactly means. Obviously, we have some things that we will accept as personal data, such as a name, an email address, a telephone number, an address, etc. But it also includes more obscure things like IP addresses. Lots of people have a problem with that definition, especially if you speak to people in tech. They say, how on earth can you recognize exactly who the person is from an IP address? Unfortunately, the legislator has said that an IP address is personal data, so it needs to be treated as such. And it's also subjective. So for example, if you use numbers or tracking codes within your company to identify a customer, that number is still personal data, or that tracking code is still personal data, because although it's only a number that allows you within your organization to recognize who a certain person is, it still does that job, so it would be personal data. So this is why when we work with organizations and we talk about them using reference numbers, we still say that needs to be treated in the same way that you would treat a name or an email address, so with the same levels of protection. I just wanted to address something that I didn't take a note of, but I'm now thinking I need to address this. When Brexit hits, the GDPR will still apply. just to make that really clear, because there's been a lot of talk about what happens to GDPR after Brexit, after we leave the EU. So the GDPR has actually been brought into national law under the Data Protection Act 2018. And so the GDPR will continue, or the principles of the GDPR will continue in the UK after Brexit as well. And finally, the GDPR applies to the processing of personal data. So sometimes there's confusion around what processing actually means. People think that it's if you put data into a filing system. Yes, but it's effectively anything from viewing, storing, analyzing, sharing, or even deleting personal data. The fact that you're doing something with that personal data is processing of personal data. So that activity is covered by the GDPR. So for example, if you're looking at personal data on a computer screen, that amounts to processing. So that's why it's important to be really careful if you're in a co-working space or in a cafe, not that they're open at this point in time, but if you're in a public space and you're viewing your screen and someone's behind you viewing your screen, that's not in line with GDPR, because that's processing data in a way that it's not meant to be processed. So as an organization, you can either be a controller of personal data or a processor of personal data. If you're a data controller, that means that you make the decisions about what happens to that data. And if you're a processor, it means that you follow the instructions of the data controller when you're processing that data. I'll go into that in a bit more detail a little bit later, because I appreciate that's a bit confusing. But if you're a data controller, you need to make sure that you comply with GDPR, as you will be accountable for managing the personal data in accordance with the law. So a controller of personal data, as I said, determines the reason they're collecting the data and what they do with it, as well as the way it's being processed. Data processor can only act on behalf of the controller and under their explicit written instructions. So an example of this is if you're a retail store, you're selling clothing items, you might use Google Drive to store the names and addresses of all your customers, or HubSpot, or whatever. In this case, you make decisions about what you're doing with those names. So you use them to administer a customer's account, you want to post their clothes to them, you send them an invoice, you're making the decisions about what's happening to their personal data. But you're using Google Drive, as I said, or HubSpot. Now in these instances, Google Drive and HubSpot are your processor. So in no circumstance would HubSpot pull all the names of your customers and decide to send them a marketing email about the HubSpot product. That wouldn't happen. And that's because HubSpot is your processor. If that did happen, then that processor would be liable to the GDPR level fines, but they must act upon your instructions. So when I say they must act upon your instructions and under a written contract, that means that every time you enter into an agreement with a product, with a company, with an agent, with a third party, anybody with whom you're sharing personal data, you must by law have a written agreement in place with them. And if you want to know what goes into that written agreement, just go into the GDPR law. I like how I just said just, as though it's a casual thing. I know it's quite confusing to read, but if you go to Article 28, there's a really clear list of all the things that need to go into a data processing agreement. Okay, so just this is the final point that I'll make on this long period of time where I'm talking. So the worst thing that can happen, what's the worst that can happen with GDPR if you're a small organization? So most of the fines we've seen today are, to be honest, to huge organizations, right? So we've had British Airways, we've had Marriott, talking fines in the millions, hundreds of millions. So what do you need? What are the main risks of GDPR for a small organization? So I think the number one risk is security. So the biggest fines that we've seen are due to security breaches, particularly with certain cases. These companies were told before, again and again, by the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the supervisory authority in the UK that looks after personal data. So they would be the body that would apply the fine and would investigate and would audit you if anything happened. So the biggest fines that we've seen are due to security incidents. So you need to make sure that you have a robust security framework in place. So wherever you store your data, that needs to be secure. Use reputable organizations. If you need to get a bit of help from a company that can help you put security measures in place, it's a good investment to do that. But what the ICO has also said is that if they ever come knocking, what they'll want to see is a robust framework of written policies and processes. People sometimes think that's a really boring thing to do. Bit of a waste of time when you're trying to build a business. I get it, but it's really worth your time, because if you sit down and write down your data protection policy, this is how I'm going to manage my data. This is what I'll do if there's ever a breach. This is what I'll do if someone asks me for a copy of my data, etc. It's always like a practice run. You will always do better in a crisis or in a moment of urgency if you've thought about what you're going to do before it hits you. So that's it from me in terms of GDPR in a nutshell.
Great, thanks, Electra. That was a really concise intro. Thank you so much for that. We're just gonna, we've got a few questions which I'm just gonna give to the panel now, and then we'll move on to the sort of hints and tips presentation after that. So the first question I wanted to ask Electra, if that's okay. So as a new business owner or business owner, what are the top GDPR challenges, do you think?
So the number one question that we get about GDPR is around marketing. As a new organization, that's the first thing you want to do. You want to tell people about your product, you want to sell it. Marketing is absolutely essential for small businesses, but there are some points to keep in mind to ensure that you're maintaining compliance when trying to reach the widest audience. There are general rules on electronic marketing because that's the medium that most companies use today. So you should not send electronic marketing to individuals unless they've specifically consented to electronic mail, or they're an existing customer who bought a similar product or service from you in the past, and you gave them a simple way to opt out of electronic marketing when you first collected their details. And then every time you email them, you have a simple way to allow them to unsubscribe from those messages.
Okay.
Is that clear? So yeah, you either get them to consent explicitly, no pre-ticked boxes, because they're not your customer, you see no pre-ticked boxes, they need to consent. Or if they're an existing customer, someone who's inquired about your service and they fill in their details in a form, you can have a pre-ticked checkbox there if they're in the purchase cycle, but you need to allow them the ability to untick that box. And then every time you email them, you need to have a link in the email that they can click and unsubscribe from. So those are the rules in relation to electronic marketing. You can then market to your existing customers. So direct marketing is effectively advertising that's directed to specific individuals through phone calls, newsletters, emails, texts, or other types of marketing material. So we're not now talking just about electronic marketing, we're talking about general direct marketing. So to market to individuals, you must obtain consent from them, or they must qualify for the soft opt-in that I mentioned above. So you took those steps to allow them to opt out at the beginning. And the best practice for obtaining consent is to invite the customer to tick a box or take some other affirmative action. Something really clear in plain English. Don't hide the consent anywhere. Just be super clear in what it is that you're asking them for and why you're asking them for it. Pre-ticked opt-in boxes are banned under the GDPR, which is potentially a little bit confusing with what I said earlier. But if you've just got a newsletter, for example, and people are entering their email address, then you're not entering into any transaction with that person. They're not a customer. So you can't just have a pre-ticked box that says, I accept for you to send me newsletters. That's not a transaction, that's not a customer. So therefore you need to get them to explicitly opt in if you want to send them more than just that newsletter, right? So basically, whenever you collect data from someone, make sure that you're telling them why you're collecting their data, and then use their data only for the reason that you've collected it. So if someone's giving you an email address to subscribe to your newsletter, don't then go and send them loads of marketing emails about your service. Don't share their data with third parties. And don't do anything with their data. I think this is the main rule that you wouldn't like other companies to do with yours.
Great, that's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'll move on to the next question for Katie, if that's okay. So obviously we're in a very different time than we were a few months ago, and hopefully we'll be able to start focusing on fully coming out of lockdown soon. But what are the main GDPR challenges that have come about during the crisis, do you think?
Yeah, so with many small businesses, people are rushing to implement new remote working strategies and working from home. So data protection, unfortunately, is usually an afterthought for a lot of small companies with that. However, a data breach under GDPR could be as simple, as Electra mentioned, as viewing personal data on your computer while you're at a co-working space and the person sitting behind you is also viewing it. They're technically processing personal data that they're not supposed to, so that would be a breach of GDPR. Other potential data breaches under GDPR would also be employees discussing sensitive information while they're at home and someone may overhear. They also can take documents away from company premises because they are working from home, and there's the potential for them to be lost or stolen, which would also be a breach under GDPR. Cybersecurity is also another huge issue while working from home. Employees are now using their own personal devices, and that they may lack robust antivirus software. They may be connected to unsecured Wi-Fi networks, or they may use applications or software that haven't been approved by your organization. As Electra mentioned, these results or these data breaches could result in pretty substantial fines from the ICO. So it's important to just be aware of security and yeah, just ensure that nobody else is viewing your personal data.
Great, thank you so much. That's really helpful. And then, so just in terms of those challenges, Electra, what or how can small businesses overcome them? What can they put in place? Maybe talk to a couple of those.
I think the simplest thing that you can do is write out a work from home policy. That's the first thing that you can do as an employer. You don't need to have you know, a legal background to do that, or an HR background. There's lots of available things online that you could access to get some inspiration, but effectively you should write out your work from home policy. For home networks, ensure that your employees are using password protected networks, or if this is possible, create a virtual private network or a VPN for them to use remotely. If employees are using personal devices, which is really common, especially in small businesses, provide guidance on how to secure their device by keeping their software up to date. Disable default or administrator accounts and create individual accounts and usernames for your staff to prevent unauthorized access, and also give staff access to remote application solutions to avoid using personal data applications when processing data. It's also really important, this is something that, you know, everyone does. I do this and then I catch myself and I say, I need to stop doing this. But sometimes I'll save something on my desktop because I either can't communicate with our drive, or I just want to access it quickly because I'm on a call, and then that thing stays on your desktop. If your laptop gets stolen, then that data, if it includes personal data, if it's a list of people that, you know, your customers, that's really sensitive personal data, and that would result in a data breach that, depending on how many names you have in that list, could potentially be reportable to the ICO. So try to minimize any storage of personal data on employees' devices, and make that really clear that that is a rule. So yeah, overall, I think this is what privacy by design is, but it's ensuring that it's in your company culture, that data protection is part of the culture, that people are thinking about it at all levels when they're going about their day.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And then final question for Katie, just before we get on to the presentation slides. How do you think the crisis will impact the way GDPR is implemented and enforced? And will the ICU cut small businesses any slack in the future, do you think?
So the ICO has put out a lot of guidance on their approach during coronavirus on how they're implementing and enforcing GDPR. So essentially, they are acting more flexibly at the moment when companies are, you know, implementing these working from home policies with a smaller staff, less resources, and less cash flow. So although they work with companies now who are doing their best to comply with data protection regulations, they are also putting out a lot of guidance on how people can manage their responsibilities and obligations as a data processor in the future. So this information is available, it's free, it's up to date, it's accessible. We are going to provide you all with some links to specific policies and checklists. So because this information is so accessible, it's unlikely that the ICO will be as lenient in the future if there is another crisis that results in people having to work from home. Companies even now are expected to have certain policies and procedures in place to handle any issues that arise from coronavirus. So data protection will be no exception in the future. So right now, as Electra and I have both mentioned quite a few times, it's very important to take the time to invest in and implement different processes and policies around data protection, since everyone will be held to the same standard in the future if there is another second wave or any other future crisis. So yeah, overall, it's not that GDPR itself is going to change, just how the ICO regulates and manages companies with their GDPR compliance will be strict again in the future.
Okay, perfect. That's really great. That's really useful. Thank you. So now I'm going to get this presentation up and let you guys go on with this. Can you see my screen? Are we happy? Perfect. Okay, so I'll move on here. Obviously you've met Electra and Katie already, and we'll move on to presentation. So off you go, guys. Thank you.
Great. So yeah, this is just a brief overview of kind of what we've discussed. We'll be providing links that are in this presentation in the chat function for all of you to access afterwards, so you'll know exactly where to go. And Quinn, if you want to go to the next slide. So the first thing that we really want to ensure all of you do is to register with the Information Commissioner's Office, ICO, if you are processing any personal data. It's actually a criminal offense not to be registered with them. So please click the link that we'll provide after this and make sure you sign up with them today. All right. And then with marketing, we did go through a lot of kind of high-level information with how you can market to existing customers. So these are just short and simple. Make sure everyone on your marketing list has not opted out of receiving marketing communications. It sounds simple and obvious, but just doing a double check and making sure that your marketing list is up to date will save you a lot of headache in the future. Always include an opt-out option in any marketing emails for future communications from you. And then if you're asking new customers to provide their email address or sign up to communications, if you have a privacy policy, make sure that it's always linked right above the button where they will click accept or submit, and that will just avoid any confusion in the future. All right, and then to the next slide. Perfect. So we've also written out just a few very basic kind of provisions that you can include in any policies and on your emails that you're sending to marketing or as marketing. So you can just read those, make note of them. If they apply for you, great, but they're just pretty standard notes. And then again, with the policies, make sure that you're linking any of your own privacy policies or data protection policies to those emails or messages or flyers, whatever you're sending. All right, and then going back to working from home and kind of managing GDPR during a crisis like coronavirus, we mentioned that it's really important to password protect any networks or create the VPN, as Electra mentioned, just to prevent any risks from using unsecured home networks or co-working space networks. When you're using personal devices, try and draft a policy for your employees to follow, just so that you have something in place that's easy to reference. If the ICO should ever come knocking, you'll have that to show, and it just covers yourself in the future from any risks. And then a lot of, the ICO has actually put out some guidance on how to handle any phishing attacks that have kind of boomed during coronavirus. A lot of people have been receiving these. So if you're able to just have a short little training session with your employees on what to watch out for during these phishing attacks, how they can respond to them, and just putting more awareness out there with your employees and your company on what to do should you see one. All right, these are all the links that we'll be posting on the chat bar. So specific guidance on handling GDPR compliance during coronavirus and those working from home situations, the policy guidance for what to write in a bring your own device policy, some more guidance on email marketing and direct marketing, and then also a link on how to identify sensitive personal data. As we mentioned earlier, personal data can take many forms, and we listed out just some of the basic personal data that many companies hold. But if you are processing any sensitive personal data, which can include race or sexual orientation or political preferences from your customers, you will need to take kind of extra steps to protect that information, because it is a higher risk to you should that information get out. So the ICO has put out really good guidance on how to identify exactly what is sensitive and what you'll need to do to take better precautions. All right, and then just some general tips that any small business should be aware of for maintaining GDPR compliance. Try not to hold on to emails, files, or documents for longer than you need to. Avoid saving them to your desktop. Try and opt for any cloud storage solutions that you find. Keep track of where all your data is saved, and be mindful when you're discussing and sharing personal data. Have regular meetings with your employees to go through data cleanses, so delete anything that's obsolete or that you should no longer have, and appoint a person or a team within your company that your staff and all of your customers can go to for any data protection questions and issues. If a customer comes to you and asks you to delete all of their personal data, it would just be very helpful to have one person or one team to go to who knows the process for deleting it, knows how to respond to that customer, and can just handle it seamlessly so you won't have any issues. And overall, just try and make data protection part of your team culture. It's once you have everything written down and in place, it's so easy to work off of in the future, but it is taking the time and the resources to write out these policies to begin with, and just make your employees aware of what you're doing to protect their personal data, make your customers aware of what you're doing to protect their personal data. So just being more open about it. All right, and then, yeah, go ahead.
Awesome, thank you, Katie. That was really helpful. Let me start my video again so everybody can see me. Hello. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we've probably got a few questions that have come into the Q&A section. So if you have any other questions, please do put them in there. Electra, have you managed to have a look through and see if there's any you wanted to specifically answer? And I will put those links that Katie mentioned in the chat box now.
Yeah, sure. So there's a good question here that says, please can you advise for a new startup coming up, what's the timeline for them to be GDPR compliant? So the law expects you to be compliant by design. So that means that you need to be compliant from the beginning. Now, obviously the ICO, which means the Information Commissioner's Office, and that's the supervisory authority in the UK that looks after data protection and will audit and investigate and fine companies if they're non-compliant or if there's a breach, then they expect you to be GDPR compliant from the beginning, but they're very reasonable. They're actually a fantastic authority. The website, if you go to the ICO website, is just full of information, really accessible, written in plain English. Some of it isn't very practical, it's kind of academic, but that's because this is a new regulation. 2 years old for a regulation is really new. So they're still working on stuff, but what they've put out there for free is fantastic, and all small organizations should just spend a couple of hours just looking through the website and familiarizing themselves. So there's no kind of leeway. There's no, here's a period of time whereby you need to be compliant. You need to be compliant from the beginning. Someone is asking whether they can write a work from home policy or a data protection policy and get it checked by the ICO. Unfortunately not. Unfortunately, you can't do that. But if you go onto the ICO website, there is a checklist of what needs to be in your data protection policy. They try to make it really practical so you can actually almost print stuff out. Don't print it out, it's not environmentally friendly, but that's the concept, that you can use things as a checklist and go through them and actually put the stuff that they're asking you to do into practice. So definitely visit the ICO website after this webinar. Someone said that keeping an ID of an individual was the same as keeping their name. What about if the only thing you knew about an individual was this number? It would not be identifiable data. Well, if that data does not allow you to identify who you're talking about, and when I say you, I mean, if it's not possible to identify who this person is, because this is an obscured number that someone's made up, then that's fine, that's not personal data. But if it's someone's national insurance number, for example, then that would be personal data, because you could find out exactly who that number is referring to via the possession of that data alone. Okay. We talked about Brexit and the impact that it's likely to have on GDPR. There won't be an impact, but there is another good question here that says that they use a well-known data storage provider based in Ireland, and they're wary that Brexit could mean that they have to move user data to the UK. Do you have an opinion as to how likely this will be? Because GDPR is here to stay, so that means no change. So it's a bit of a grey area at the moment, because we still don't know what's going to happen after Brexit. If the EU decides that we're a third country for the purposes of GDPR, that makes it really difficult to exchange data. We don't know whether the EU is going to say that we are a third country. If we are a third country, then that will mean that you need to basically put much more stringent measures in place to cover that international transfer, because the GDPR says that if you're transferring data outside the European Economic Area, you need to have certain additional measures in place before you can make that transfer. If the UK is considered a non-adequate country, or a country that's outside the European Economic Area, then we may need to put some more stringent measures in place. Some companies are taking measures to just get their data out of the UK and put it somewhere like Ireland or Germany or somewhere like that, because they know that they will continue to be in the EU. But we don't have a definitive answer at the moment, unfortunately. No one does. So I think I've answered most of the questions here.
Okay.
If anyone has any more questions, let us know.
I actually do see, so someone just asked, are mobile phone numbers alone identifiable data? And that would be a yes, because you can identify the person with their phone number. So yes, that would be personal data. And then I also see, who would be liable if your data is hacked? Would you be fined? Yes, the ICO would fine you, because you needed to have protections set in place to protect that data. So it technically is your fault for allowing that data to be leaked or breached. So the ICO would come after you. Yeah.
So exactly, the ICO isn't, it's not a dictator that comes along and finds everyone and someone to be really scared of, but it will ask you to put measures in place. It will usually give you time to rectify certain things. So if someone's complained about you, or if you've had a hack and it's your first hack and it's a small scale hack, it's likely that the ICO will try to help you to remediate the situation to make sure that this doesn't happen again. But if it happens again, and then again, then you probably will get fined. So that's yeah. Although it seems like you're the victim because you've been hacked, it's your responsibility to make sure that you have the right level of security in place.
Mm-hmm. There also are a couple people who are asking if they need to register with the ICO. One company is an investment advisory, and the other is a property developer who keeps data of builders, and they are wondering if they need to register with the ICO. I would assume so if you're processing any personal data.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you are processing any personal data, then you must register with the ICO. I think registration is about £45 or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but it's not expensive and you need to register. It's a really simple process. It's online, so you can do it there.
And
Cool.
sorry, I see a couple more questions. Someone also asked if there are any similar laws in the US. The only similar law to GDPR is it's the California Care Protection Act, I believe, the CCPA. That's the law in the US that's most similar to the GDPR. It's also pretty strict and kind of heavy protection for individuals for their personal data. But the rest of the country isn't quite there yet, and hopefully they will be. But just so far, California is the only one with similar laws.
Mm-hmm.
And then registration with the ICO, should you register when the trading starts or when the user starts registering?
I think, put simply, if you're processing any personal data, if you're storing data, collecting emails, communicating with people, then you are a processor of data, a data controller, and so you will need to register with the ICO. The ICO is less interested in when you start trading and how long you've been up and running. It's more about, are you processing personal data? And if so, are you doing it in the right way?
Yeah. If most of your data was or is findable online, such as through LinkedIn or websites or Twitter, would this data be defined as sensitive data if you're a PR agency?
So this is a tricky one, and one that we get asked a lot. So if you're putting your data in a public forum, that doesn't necessarily give people the right to take that data, store it on their database, and start marketing to you, or start contacting you to provide you with services, etc. So you shouldn't be going on LinkedIn and pulling lists of people. That's not what LinkedIn's there for. And if you look at the T's and C's of these platforms, they will clearly state that you shouldn't be doing that. So yeah, just because data is in the public forum doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. The same way when you sign up to Facebook or LinkedIn and then you get some person calling you on your mobile phone and you say, where did you get my number? And they say LinkedIn. You get that creepy feeling. Whenever you get that feeling of this is wrong, it probably is with data protection. It's quite an intuitive law when it comes to that. So yeah, just because someone's created a profile in a public forum doesn't give other organizations the right to pull that data and use it for their own use. The person gave the data to LinkedIn to sign up with a profile. They didn't give the data to LinkedIn so that other companies would take the data and then use it for their own purposes. Will GDPR cover USA and other territories' requirements? Probably. There are a few nuances, but the GDPR at the moment is the strongest law, the one with the strictest regulations. We have lots of US clients actually that come to us and ask us for support in implementing GDPR, even though it doesn't necessarily apply to them, because they understand that it's best practice. So yeah, we can't advise on US law, of course, but typical lawyer saying that, but it's true.
Were there any more that you wanted to cover, ladies? I think more questions that want to come in, or I think we maybe come to the end of the Q&A. There were some really great questions there, so thank you everybody that sent in a question. I just wanted to say thank you to Electra and Katie. First of all, it's been a fantastic session. I hope all the attendees have enjoyed it and has got as much out of it as I have. I learned a lot today, so thank you. Just a quick reminder about what we do at Tide. Hopefully a lot of you are new to Tide who have joined the session here and maybe aren't members with us. We are really in place to save small businesses sort of time and money with their banking. So if you want to give us a tryout, it's obviously risk-free. We'll be sending an email around after this webinar, giving you a link on how to sign up. Use the email that you registered for this event to sign up, and you'll be open to some special offers from us. It really is easy, 5 to 10 minutes. Get yourself a sort code and account number, and you can try this out for absolutely free. And we would hope to see you as a member very soon and start saving some time and money. But thank you all once again, Electra and Katie. Really interesting webinar. This webinar will be up on our website as an on-demand within the next week or so. We'll be in touch via email again to let you know when that's happened. But for now, thank you so much, and we'll see you again. So, one more thing, I'm just going to post in the chat the link to our Tide events page so you can keep up to date with the other webinars and other events we've got coming up. So please do visit that and register for any other events and webinars you're interested in. And we hope to see you all as Tide members soon and at future events. So thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.